There we are.
There we are. Good, good. All right. So as people are joining, I apologize. So we've got a half hour, less than half hour session that I recorded of just the splinter group that was not seeing Roshin, and now as Roshin's group is coming coming through. Um, just check. Julie's not able to join us today. I'm just going to say something to Julie, and now I'm going to just remind everybody that I've just sent all this out. Because I have I am using my Zoom account for both of those sessions, and it didn't occur to me that we were going to be in trouble um, if I used this account for the same meeting with Roisin. All right, just give me a second here, and I'm going to forward a message to make sure everybody understands that we are on Zoom. Okay, sorry for the delay, folks. I need an admin. I have sent. There we go. All right. Just plug in the invitation just so that people don't have to keep jumping around. Copy that. All right, we're back. We're back and we're raring to go. I'm sorry about all this. There was no other way to do this without having to add an entire week to the class to be able to fit this in because of my schedule and Roshin's schedule didn't line up during the week. So this is how we had to do it. So we were looking at Nikki. Nikki, are you okay if I share your chart? Could we look at your chart while we're talking about this? Because I think it's really interesting. And it actually it does tie in fact, to our, hang on, I just have to find Nikki's chart. So it does tie in fact, to um, our session today, and that's why I wanted to poke at it a little bit. So we'll look at different charts today around the sun and the moon particularly. But what I just wanted to finish up the idea that we started in the original recording, which you will all get as well. Nikki. Okay. All right, so I'm going to share that chart so we can all follow along. Here we go. So are you with us still, Nikki?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay. All right. So this is Nikki's chart, and we were talking about, okay, so here's the difference now, because you were thinking of this as a 12th house, and it's this Mercury retrograde that I was looking at when we were talking about the notion of the 12th house as representing loss. I couldn't visualize the chart, so it's an interesting dynamic because we've got Saturn here ruled by Mars. Mars is in the 10th house in Libra. It's with Pluto, and we'll see when we look at different charts that also we have to factor that in as well. These conjunctions become important, but just to simplify things, we have a Sun in the first house with the ascendant in the same sign, which really emphasizes the ruler of that ascendant. We have a Mercury in the same sign, retrograde, so retrograding away from the 12th house. Always, I like to give the idea, and I'll repeat these things as we go through the course, but I like to give the idea of the retrograde planets. If you think of them as like a little glyph that's running or like moving away from something when it's retrograde. Think of it as like I'm trying to get away from this thing, and I find it helpful. I'm a very visual person. I find it helpful because what the question is what is it trying to get away from? And in this case, the Mercury is trying to get away from this Neptune and Jupiter. It's trying to move in a way from what can feel confusing, overwhelming because it's not clear, or overwhelming because it's maybe not honest. And that Mercury is trying to move back into a space of integrity, back into a space that is its own because it's first house as well. To concretize something, to understand something, to make sense of something. So this is how I interpret those kinds of things, just to give that, because that's what we were talking about, this Mercury. But we have to go through the process of the rulership. We were talking about the Saturn ruled by Mars, and it's ruled by a Mars that is a little bit drained of energy or drained of its Mars capacity, simply because it's always accommodating other people. But we will see in future sessions how powerful angular planets are. So we have an angular Sun, an angular Mercury, and an angular Mars. Very, very powerful. Mars is also the exaltation ruler of the Sun. So the fact that the actual ruler of the Sun and the exaltation ruler of the Sun are somehow in a, we can't really fully call it a partnership because they're not actually supporting each other. They're kind of invisible to each other in a way. They are very important to the story. Then with Mars, we have to look to Venus, and then with Venus, we find finally we've got this ultimate dispositor, Jupiter. And what's happening to Jupiter is it's in the 12th house. And so that's part of this dynamic of the issue we were talking about, which can have been the loss of a sibling, the loss that is actual a literal loss, somebody has died, or somebody is no longer present in the physical, maybe having gone across the world, especially with the 12th house. That can also be that, an emigration story, migration story, or they've checked out, and there's some kind of a sense of there's an emotional, psychological, or a spiritual checking out, or there can actually be, especially with Neptune so close by, there can actually be a disruption in terms of which, what do we call that? Like magical thinking, or trying to through drugs or through other means to escape reality. So this is also part of a bigger dynamic. We'll look at these bit by bit. I don't want to get into necessarily a full chart reading, but we were really looking at that, the quality of that Mercury. So in a Placidus chart, Mercury is in the 12th house, and in the whole sign, it's in the first house. So as I said in the first session, or when it maybe last week, I can't remember, when a planet is above the ascendant, we can think of it also as a 12th house planet. You can think of it having that property of not really being clear, not really being seen, because although it's felt very, very viscerally in the first house, it's very much a modus operandi for the person in that first house way. The person manifests this energy. But I find it really helpful to think along those terms because it gives us a kind of a dual quality of understanding that planet is kind of behind the scenes. It's not only this 12th house stuff that's behind the scenes, but it's also this what is going on behind the scenes. Now, the strength of Jupiter here with the Neptune suggests that there's a faith issue or religious issue that is combining here. Mercury rules the 9th house of the road to God, sometimes we call it, or our sense of faith, our sense of religion, our sense of political belief, and so on. And that can also be a loss of faith or a betrayal within one's faith. And of course, for a woman in the natal chart, we look to Jupiter. We're going to see that again now when I do the presentation. We look to Jupiter for the spouse. And that I would say, even, for example, in a homosexual couple, you want to kind of get a feeling of either is it Venus or is it Jupiter, because both can be applied, but you'll get a feeling for the individual, and then you'll know I want to look towards Jupiter or I want to look towards Venus, because that issue might come up for you. And so there's something here that can also be around that notion of something is I have to shed something, I have to move away from something that has to do with faith or religion, dogma, all the Sagittarian qualities. And of course, that dynamic where the nodes are, we'll talk about more specifically because that also is really important in a natal chart. But all of this from the 12th house can also be most especially about emigration stories, migration, moving away, escaping. That's the word I was looking for earlier, is the escapism, because we're looking at something here that can literally be about having to get away from something, having to separate oneself out from something, come back to reality or deal with reality because of that mercurial thing. Is it about a sibling? Is it about a cousin? Is it about a communication issue? Um, and then this notion of taking responsibility and community was what we were talking about when we were switching over from the previous recording, and that understanding of the Saturn, which is quite pinched in Mars ruled Scorpio. It can be quite tricky because there's often a need to really look at things sort of point blank and the underbelly of things, or coping with things that are chaotic or crisis laden or stressful, being the one thing that can could be felt like a pillar to others, be felt like a secure place for others, but it's difficult to find that security for oneself. Pluto has the same kind of quality here too. So before we move into the presentation, because then I'd like to come back to a couple of your charts to look at that through the lens of the presentation. I just want to check with Nikki if there was something that she wanted to add for us here.
No, I mean, you have stimulated some questions because of the accuracy for sure, but, and, because I'm not used to the whole sign and it's accurate. I just was, when you have a planet with whole sign, like the sun above the ascendant, you look at it like the first house and you also look at it like the 12th, but you
Well,
look with both, right?
so wait, it's just my way. That's how I've learned that it works. It's just an intuition that I had to do that. It really works. When I connect with people, where if I imagined, here's something that I find really important to say, and I can't remember, somebody asked me this question about the conjunctions, and here we have a conjunction between Mars Pluto, for example, and maybe that was in a video comment on YouTube, but still the notion of out of sign conjunctions, there's a way of looking at that, like the Indian astrology traditionally would say, no, that's just not a conjunction. Those are two different signs. We're not looking at that. To a limited extent, also Hellenistic astrology will just say that's Mars and Libra, and that's a separate thing to Pluto. Well, they wouldn't look at Pluto, but separate thing to a planet right next door in Scorpio. But I find that if we ignore these things, we're getting so much information, and that especially applies to the angles. It especially applies to the ascendant, descendant, and the midheaven IC axis. When you have planets that are in this case, for example, can represent the fourth house, because we're looking at the IC, can represent the fourth house, but it's in the fifth house. We find a way to understand both. See? So here we have Saturn. It's not, I'm going to pretend it's a closer conjunction. I would still look at that, but it's not a tight conjunction. But still, that Saturn is affecting the midheaven as if it were in the 10th house, or actually ninth house, but it's in the 11th house. So that's a Saturn behind the midheaven, which becomes the 10th house boundary in a quadrant chart system. So that's my way of, I'm just showing you how I interpret that. So if you get into a textbook about what whole sign houses represent, that's not the way. Okay. So if we're talking whole sign, it's Capricorn all the way in the first house. And I have, through my experience of all these hundreds, or I don't know how many thousands of charts, I realized that if I don't factor that in individual's experience, the internalized or hidden experience of those planets, I don't understand much of this, because there, for example, we see in a whole sign chart, the sun is extremely powerful for this individual. They will operate from this solar place. The influence of the father is very strong, but the father's absent also. So then there's an absence of influence. There's an absence that might be an emotional, where the father's physically right there, but there's a misfiring. There's no connection somehow. There's something that's lacking, and that we get a greater sense of that from the 12th house interpretation, as well as the connection that the ruler has in this pokey kind of prickly sextile with a Mars ruled Saturn. Does that make sense to you? So this is a lot of what I'm sharing here is not necessarily orthodox. It's what I've learned through my work and through what I'm looking at. So sometimes we have to um, trust your instincts and say, gosh, that really feels like something different, and I'm going to say that. So do that. And you can say it in a way that says, I think this might be true, so that the person is kind of being, enticed into understanding themselves in this new way or this way that they feel, but they have never been able to see. And so trust those ways of looking at the chart. That's why I wanted you to, and no issue if you didn't see Roisin, but that's what I was trying to get at with Roisin. She's looking at the natal chart, not that you have to be like her, but she's looking at it from a place of profound intuition so that she often mixes up the rules. And that's why she keeps saying, I'm not an astrologer, because I keep saying to her, to really, we have rules that we have to follow, so people won't understand you if you say certain things. So if you know that we're looking at that from this purely intuitive place and we say, well, I know this is a separate sign. I know that's a separate sign and house, but they have to have a relationship, surely, right? Pluto is very slow moving. It's going to be stuck at that degree point for a long, long time. It'll come back to that degree point over 2 years. And Mars is quite fast moving, depending. Let's see, how fast is your Mars? Um, Mars is direct and fast at this moment. That means within a couple of days, it's on Pluto. You see, so it's anyway within a couple of days of this child's birth, it's completely, entirely perfected, that conjunction. So that 8th of January birth date also, if we look at that, again, the 8 being the power number and representing that the strength and the power, um, anyone born with the 8th of January has a very powerful presence. And a lot of that has to do with this mid-Capricorn sun. So the planets that are in the middle of the sign are really powerful, so we've got a Saturn ruling that from the middle of the sign. We don't have to be precise, but the more precise it is towards 15 degrees, the more powerful we can say it is, right? So just
Is it the same for the ascendant or just the planet on the middle of the sign?
anything in the middle of the sign, but of course the sun represents the individual and their life purpose. So we know that there's like, woof, we're going to get 100% Capricorn energy here. We're going to get a real, like pure expression of Capricorn. Also, if you look at the very, very 0 degree, so it's a very strong, although it's a retrograde planet, but let's imagine it's direct. It's a very strong, pure expression of the planet to be in the 0 degree. It's just launching into that. In the 29th degree, we also have strength. These are called the critical degrees. These are the degrees that are expressing something that has been like fully dipped in Capricorn here, for example, fully intensely trying to be the Capricorn in the very beginning, really running into that energy and trying to be it happily in it. Don't need any more instructions. Got the Capricorn vibe, and the ascendant says, I got this now. I understood this whole Capricorn lesson, and it's this intensity. And it doesn't mean that you can't be any more or less Capricorn in other degrees, but it's very symbolic when you look at that energy. Like for example, when we find squares coming through those particular degrees, squares at 0 degrees. That's why we're in this period of time currently with this, especially cardinal. We're looking at cardinal placements here. That cardinality is it's like a slap over the head. It's like, get going. Let's do this new thing. Go. And the square says, I need to adjust the way that I do this. I need this to feel different. It's going to have to move in a different direction. So we had that, for example, recently with the Jupiter squared by or Saturn squared by Jupiter, and then later the Venus squaring Saturn, Neptune, and so on. And it continues as well. So into next year. So we're not done with it. Okay, Nikki, we'll come back to your chart because I think these are really great examples of what we're looking at today. So I'm just going to stop with this.
Can I ask one more question?
Yep.
Like, and I'm sure you've said it before, but I can't seem to remember. So the ICMC, normally when I look at charts, it's like the ninth or 10th house, but this is like the 22nd degree in the 11th house. What moves, can you remind me what moves it?
Yeah,
over?
because if we look at the date here, right? This is Logan,
Mm-hmm.
Utah. So that's what is
Mm-hmm.
that, like 46, what does it say here? 40, okay, 41 north latitude, you see? 41 north latitude.
Mm-hmm.
So that's quite far from the equator. So zero
Oh,
being
okay.
on the equator, that's really far north. And it's also in the darkest period of the year, right? So this point of the midheaven is, where's the sun on the uppermost point, what would be high noon, let's say, on that day? That's the
Mm-hmm.
midheaven. And so
Okay.
you go out in Logan, Utah on the 8th of January, the sun is really low on the horizon. It would irritate you. It's like really low. And as far as you go farther north, you might get your midheaven even in the 12th house.
Wow. Okay.
So that's one of the reasons why I stopped doing quadrant houses, because it just makes it's beyond, it stops making sense at a certain point that the houses are reduced to a fragment, and other houses are so enormous that you see, the whole quadrant house system emerged from Mesopotamia, from the Greco Babylonian style of doing astrology, which is very close to the equator, which is roughly 12 to 13 hours of daylight every day of the year. It doesn't really change hugely. If you go to have a holiday in Greece, somewhere in Greece, you'll know that even in the middle of summer, you get just a little bit more sun, maybe an hour extra sun compared to the peak of winter. So that's why the system worked quite well up until that point, or up until that geographical limit, let's say. And once you go beyond that geographical limit, it just stops making sense. So we go back, in fact, to the original system of one sign per house, and we don't have this confusion. Then the midheaven, and we'll look at this again separately in the next session. The midheaven and the ascendant become a point in the chart that is a sensitive point, a very important point, but it's not the beginning of the energy of the house. It's within. It's like a nodal point. So we want to look at that a little differently if you've been taught through the process of the, say, Placidus or Koch houses, or let's say Porphyry, any of those styles of Campana. Um, all of them use these quadrant style houses. And Regiomontana is the one that's used most often, or at least traditionally, for horary astrology, because they're really focused on those cusps, and knowing the degrees of those cusps really helps. But I also find I get super quick answers with the whole sign, and that always is a point of annoyance to the purists who do the horoscopic, the horary type of astrology, because they want to look through the lens of what is, the degrees and the angles and so on. But you can find your answer right away. If the first thing that jumps out of the whole sign, you can then check it back in the Regiomontana system and confirm your initial assumption, but it's almost always right.
Thank
Um,
you.
like I'll just give you an example. As we were doing a class in that reference in the whole sign house, Venus was in the 7th house, and the question was, a person has lost her jewelry. Where did she last leave it? That was the question, the horary question. And so they went through all of these different things, and trying to find what's the connection between this and that because of these. And I said, look, Venus representing jewelry, because that's what we look for in the representation of what the planets signify, depending. Venus was in the 7th house. She left her jewelry at her boyfriend's house, and that's the answer. That was the answer, and it jumps out of the whole sign chart. So if you are using other styles of charts, what I really encourage you to do, which is what I did for almost a year, is do both together simultaneously. Take your favorite system and pair it up with the whole sign system, and keep checking. Just get your information from both and see which is really crying out to you. Um, and then ultimately you settle on the one that just speaks loudest to you. There's no one right way of reading the chart. There's a million ways of reading the chart. Just as you saw with Roisin, she's picking up on things. That's why I didn't want to get engaged when people were suggesting certain things in the comments. I don't want to interrupt her intuition, because she's reading the chart in a way that's not the same as how we would look at the chart. She's getting her information from her intuition, much less from the chart than you might imagine. All right, let's have a look at, are there any questions based on anything at all? from this or from what we've done so far, from last week or the first week? Or... All good? All right. Okay. So what I'll do is I'm going to just simply stop this recording just so that we can have it in little bits, bite-sized pieces, so we're not overlapping too many subjects.